Hello, Mr. Montalvo here for U.S. History. And today we're taking a look at Unit 3, Lesson 3, Day 2, Washington's Presidency. And our two objectives for today, one is to examine the evolution of the unwritten Constitution, such as Washington's creation of the presidential cabinet and the development of political parties. And then we'll also examine the events of the early nation, including Hamilton's economic plan. Now, in order to move through today's lesson, it's important to identify a few key terms here. Now, you'll hear the term called precedent, and different from president. A precedent is an act or decision that sets an example for others to follow. George Washington, the nation's first president, set many precedents, and you'll understand that a bit more as we go through. National debt. A national debt is the total sum of money a government owes. And a bond. A bond is a certificate that promises to repay the money loaned plus interest on a certain date. So Americans voted in George Washington as the first president, and James Adams was elected as the first vice president. In New York City, this would become the nation's first capital. We'll discuss how it moves eventually to what would become Washington, D.C. In a few. During his 2 terms in office, Washington set many precedents. In 1796, he decided not to run for a 3rd term. And in so, his refusal to seek a 3rd term set a precedent that others would follow all the way up until 1940. The first Congress met in 1789, and it created 5 executive departments. The departments of State, Treasury, and War, and the offices of the Attorney General and the Postmaster. So Washington appoints Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, the lead diplomat right under the president, and Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury in charge of the nation's money, but also in charge of the nation's debt. All of these department heads made up the president's cabinet. Now, the Constitution did not call for a cabinet for the president. So this is where we see the idea of an unwritten constitution, where Washington starts to set these precedents, particularly these cabinet positions, where he can have assistants taking over various parts of his job. Now, members of the president's cabinet gave him advice and directed his departments. The United States was in debt because the new government borrowed money to pay for the revolution. And the United States also borrowed money by issuing bonds. Alexander Hamilton developed a plan to buy up all the old bonds issued before 1789 and to sell new bonds to pay off the old debt. This very creative solution was not welcomed by everyone in the government. When the economy improved, he would pay off the old bonds, and many people opposed this plan, including bankers and investors, and many of the group known as the Anti-federalists, against a large central government. Now, in order to settle the nation's debt, Hamilton agreed to move the capital from New York to the South if Southerners supported full payment of the bonds. Now, due to the economic situation in the South, once again, we remember primarily due to slave labor, the South was able to pay off its debts a lot faster than the North. And under this federal system, now the debt belonged to all of the states and under his plan. So in a way to convince the Southerners to support and to assist with the payment of these bonds, Hamilton and the government agreed to move the capital from New York City to the South, between the areas of Maryland, rather between the states of Maryland and Virginia. which would become known as the District of Columbia. Now, here's where Hamilton and Jefferson differ. Jefferson relied more on a strict interpretation of the Constitution, going word for word. So if the Constitution did not mention the government having that power, then the government did not have that power. Now, the reverse of that is a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which was followed by Alexander Hamilton and his followers. So loose interpretation, meaning that the government can do whatever is necessary and proper in order to execute its goals. But once again, those anti-federalists believed that this was an abuse of power. So the Constitution was the most evident in the debate over the creation of the Bank of the United States in 1791. Thomas Jefferson opposed Alexander Hamilton's plan because it would depend on a loose interpretation of the Constitution. However, the newly created Bank of the United States helped to stabilize the economy. The Whiskey Rebellion of August 1794 was the product of growing discontent of grain farmers who resented a federal tax imposed in their distillery products. Now, this was the first attempt of its kind to tax a particular good by the United States following the Revolution. As growers threatened tax collectors, Washington at first tried to prosecute the resistors in the court system. In 1794, however, 6,000 men, angry at the tax, gathered in a field near Pittsburgh and challenged Washington and the federal government to disperse them. Now, according to a biographer of the times, Joseph Elias, in His Excellency George Washington, the aging president, mounted his horse on September 30th to lead a force of 13,000, larger than any army amassed in one place during the Revolution, to quell this uprising. Now, this was important to make sure that this movement did not receive further support because the protests were all too familiar to those who were familiar with the Revolution, with the tarring and feathering of tax collectors and protests in the streets. So in 1789, when Washington took office, there was no political party. By the time he retired, there were two political parties competing for power. Jefferson supporters were known as the Democratic Republicans, mostly farmers, craft workers, and some wealthy planters. Now, once again, this is the group that is also referred to in what would become a derogatory term, really, the Anti-federalists. To be considered anti-anything is a negative connotation. And Hamilton and his supporters were called the Federalists. And they were supported by merchants and manufacturers and cities. Now, there is an article attached to this lesson, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and I'm asking for you to identify two different groups of people that were affected by the events described in the article, so the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and write a paragraph for each group explaining how the group was affected by the event using details from the text. So try to cite and explain your evidence. And then we're going to take a look at the cabinet battles or the issues between Hamilton and Jefferson and listen to some clips from the musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda. And so this is a very interesting task, very fun to do. Please do not forget the written test that's on the last page. Also, before to complete part 2, please go back to the lesson before this one and make sure you've completed part 1 to provide that context for these rap battles, these cabinet battles that you'll be listening to. And in closing for today, try to explain the fundamental differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. As we've discussed today, how are they the same, or rather mostly how are they different, and why you believe so, considering the groups of people who made up those different parties. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.